Okay. Hi, everybody. On behalf of the Northwest Territories Council on Invasive Species, Pests, and Pathogens, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for the first in our series of webinars to celebrate National Invasive Species Action Week. Today, we are excited to have two talks related to potential invasive species in agriculture, which is a growing sector in the Northwest Territories. The two species we'll be talking about today, or two groups rather, are wild pigs and managed bees. To get us started, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Maria Leung. Maria is a wildlife biologist living in the Yukon since 2004. She has a special interest in projects and research that contribute to the conservation of wildlife species, especially the vulnerable or less charismatic and often undervalued ones. Her most recent work with native pollinators was part of a larger project on the beneficial management practices for wildlife species at risk on agricultural lands in the Yukon. Maria earned a Bachelor of Science from University of Guelph and a Master's at the University of British Columbia in wildlife biology and is a registered professional biologist of BC for over 25 years. Maria's talk will differentiate between managed bees and native ones, and then introduce the risks that honeybees and managed bumblebees pose to native pollinators. So with that, I'll hand things over to Maria to get us started.
Thank you, Joanna. So in the last decade, I have had a few projects involving people and bees. During that time, I became increasingly aware that there is a lot of misunderstanding about the role of managed bees in wildlife conservation. By the end of this talk, I hope you will have a better understanding of this. The prairie crocus, which is Yukon's most well-known spring flower, is being used by a honeybee in this photo. First off, I need to explain the concept of risk. Risk assessment is implicit in decisions made to control invasive species, pests, and pathogens. It is also used in prioritizing conservation efforts. Some of you who are involved with the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, COSEWIC for short, are familiar with the different criteria used to determine what level of endangerment a species should be assigned. This would be a risk assessment. Risk can be written as an equation, the product of the probability times the actual impact. Risk can also be illustrated as a diagram. When both the probability and the impact are high, then the risk is high. When both are low, then the risk is low. Measures of probability could include proximity of the introduced organism to vulnerable resources, reproductive capacity, dispersal ability, etc. Measures of impact could include damage to native fauna, ecosystems, economy, and so on. Measures of probability and of impacts as it pertains to managed bees and native pollinators will become evident as we move through this presentation. Recently, I was part of a team that put together a set of beneficial management practices for wildlife species at risk on agricultural lands in Yukon. There is one section in this that is dedicated to insect pollinators, with an emphasis on the 4 bumblebee species at risk in Yukon: the McKay's western bumblebee, the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee, Suckley's bumblebee, and the yellow bandit bumblebee. I have listed the main threats to these species here, with the last two being the threat from managed bees, both domesticated bumblebees and honeybees. We did devise BMPs to address all the threats, but will only speak to the subset on managed bees. The BMPs are online and available for download if you're interested in learning more. Commercially raised bumblebees can be purchased for use in greenhouses in Canada, mainly for tomato and pepper production. From the 1980s through the 1990s, the Microsporidium Nosema bombi increased sharply in commercially raised bumblebee stocks in North America. Though Nosema bombi is endemic to North America, scientists have postulated that a novel strain was introduced to commercially raised bumblebees, and this spilled into the native populations. This organism causes dysentery in bumblebees, and a certain subset of closely related bumblebees are particularly susceptible. Declining populations of bumblebees, such as the gypsy cuckoo bumblebee, have been found to have particularly high rates of Mycosporidian infection. The problem with using commercially reared bumblebees is that it is difficult to guarantee that they are disease-free. Even in a rearing facility which is sanitized, the pollen used to raise the bumblebees could be contaminated. Making our native bumblebees sick is not the only potential impact. In parts of the world, introduced bumblebees have usurped native bees. Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee used in greenhouses, is already well established in the lower mainland of BC. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency did publish a set of guidelines to mitigate the risk of domesticated bumblebees to wild populations in 2013. It is called the Bumblebee Sector Guide to the National Bee Farm Level Biosecurity Standard. The guidelines recommend disposal of commercial bumblebee hives at the end of the production cycle or earlier if pests are suspected. This standard also recommends that greenhouse entrances be designed to prevent escapes. In Yukon, there would be little chance of these guidelines being enforced, so our BMPs recommended something more simple. We recommend that commercially reared bumblebees be prohibited from entry to Yukon. Newfoundland already prohibits the import of commercially produced bumblebees in its wildlife regulations. Okay, on to honeybees. To understand the potential threat that honeybees pose to native pollinators, we need to go back in history. European honeybees were brought to North America by settlers and were used primarily for the production of honey and wax up until the early 20th century. The trend towards industrial agriculture and the growth in the human population resulted in a shift to larger farms, monocultures, and reduced wildlands adjacent to and interspersed within the agricultural landscape. That meant a loss of native pollinators and a greater demand for imported pollination services. Today, a significant portion of income from commercial beekeeping is for pollination services, especially almonds in California. These photos illustrate the difference between a young agricultural landscape and a much more established one. The upper photo is among the densest area of agricultural lands in Yukon. Forests and riparian are still part of this landscape. In contrast, the photo below is of Central Valley, California, which actually supplies a significant amount of food to Yukon. It is largely devoid of the original forest, grasslands, and wetland habitats that had once graced the landscape. Around 2006, mass die-offs of honeybee hives, a phenomenon named colony collapse disorder, highlighted the dependency of the agricultural industry on honeybees for pollination. The media coverage fueled a social movement to save the honeybee, and many joined the effort thinking that they were, incorrectly, saving an endangered species and participating in wildlife conservation. Various governments and businesses chipped in. Remember the Cheerios Bring Back the Bees campaign? Even well-established conservation organizations promoted this, and so the misunderstanding gained a foothold and took off. Part of the public response was a surge in beekeeping. To demonstrate how the misunderstanding is continuing to be perpetuated, I'm going to play you part of a news clip introducing a recent study on pollinator deficits, food consumption, and consequences for human health from this year.
It seems like a logical link to make. No food, no people. Now, for the first time, researchers are directly connecting the dots between the struggles for insects that pollinate plants and hundreds of thousands of human deaths. Sam Sampson has the story.
This is what Andrew Hamilton's childhood sounded like. The Saskatchewan father grew up in a beekeeping family. He wants to grow his apiaries near Regina from 300 to 500 colonies this spring.
And we were supposed to expand last year, but it was a bad year for honeybees.
Almost half of Canada's honeybee colonies didn't survive last winter due to invasive species and bad weather. For Hamilton, it was bad for his bottom line. But new research suggests a loss of pollinators like that is also bad for our health. A recent study from Harvard suggests low pollinator numbers contribute to more than 400,000 excess deaths every year. Samuel Myers is the senior author of the study.
We were surprised because it's a pretty large effect, and so it's a little bit...
Just affordable food for people to eat equals unhealthy humans that live with chronic, potentially fatal illness like heart disease and cancers.
Anybody who's eating less of those foods than they might otherwise do because of the cost is having their health affected by having fewer pollinators around.
It would not be surprising for concerned citizens to support more beekeeping in response to hearing this. However, this is not what the study is advocating. Listen to these quotes taken directly from the publication.
Wild pollinators, in particular, are under growing threat. Pervasive land use changes are fracturing, shrinking, and degrading suitable habitats for pollinators worldwide, not only reducing available areas for nesting but limiting pollinators' ability to migrate as an adaptation strategy in an increasingly disjointed landscape. Managed honeybees, facing sometimes catastrophic hive collapse caused by pest and nutrition pressures, have not been able to compensate for wild pollinator losses nor keep pace with the growth in pollinator-dependent crops that rely on them, which makes the use of managed bees an increasingly risky solution to compensate for wild pollinator losses.
Honeybees are domestic livestock. They are not endangered. As Jeff Ullerton, a professor and author of Pollinators and Pollination, Nature and Society, puts it, keeping hives to save bees is like keeping chickens to save birds. So what is the problem of raising a lot of honeybees? One problem is pathogen spillover. The list includes Nosema ceranae, microsporidium, Israeli acute paralysis virus, deformed wing virus, sac brood virus, black queen cell virus, and small hive beetle. In Yukon, this may also include a wax moth. I found this in a bumblebee colony a couple years ago, but the only known native species occurs in eastern Canada, and the others are all introduced. Wax moths can spread from contaminated honeybee hives. Other problems include competition and ecosystem disruption. I will illustrate this. A honeybee hive typically starts with 10,000 workers in spring. This number will increase through the growing season and can reach 60,000 or more. Honeybees are journalist foragers, which makes them suitable for many crops and able to capitalize on many native flowers. They can travel long distances, several kilometers, to collect food. Honeybees have a complex communication system in which skilled bees tell co-workers where to find the food. This gives the honeybees the ability to monopolize pollen and nectar sources. This is a set of photos I took last summer. They are all from my small strawberry and raspberry patch. This is what a pollinator community looks like. Having such diversity creates resiliency in pollination services provided by native insects. When one species is having a challenging year and unable to pollinate as much as usual, there is a good chance that another species will fill the gap. I will introduce you to a few of the members of this community. The bumblebee is the most recognizable pollinator in the north. It is capable of foraging at low temperatures, which makes it particularly useful for early flowering crops such as haskap bushes. Bumblebees are capable of buzz pollination, in which they vibrate their wings at a specific frequency to stimulate flowers like blueberries to release their pollen. Bumblebees forage on a wide variety of food plants and are in flight throughout the growing season. 100 workers would be considered a large colony in Yukon, though I have not seen this. The most I have counted using the number of cells is around 50 and is minuscule compared to the size of a honeybee colony. The mining bee has a short flight season and is also capable of buzz pollination. The leafcutter bees also have a shorter flight season, and some species have more specialized diets, being able to digest the oily coating of some aster pollen. The hoverflies are a very large and important group of pollinators. These include species that, as larvae, feed on aphids, so not only do they pollinate, they also function as pest control. The bee fly feeds on flowers as adults and parasitizes other insects as larvae. Calliphoridae flies are useful composters, feeding on dung and carrion as larvae. Manure paddies are often occupied by these. Then there are the wasps, in this case a yellow jacket which preys on arthropods. Adult bristle flies will feed on flowers. As larvae, they parasitize insects and other arthropods. And then there is the maverick, the cabbage root maggot fly, which is not native to Canada and a crop pest. Having a large number of honeybees can displace the native community of flower visitors, and by doing so, the relationships that contribute to a functional ecosystem could also be suppressed. The potential impacts are real. Here are a couple studies that document the negative consequences imposed on native bees by honeybee hives. The study site for the more recent publication is Montreal and documents a decline in wild bees with an increase in honeybee abundance. The other study is from southern France and found that high-density beekeeping reduced foraging success of wild bees by 50% or more. What can be done to reduce the risk of honeybees to native pollinators? Earlier, I had introduced risk as being a product of probability and the potential impacts. Here I will list recommendations to reduce the probability of the negative impacts. Ensure that honeybees brought into Yukon do not have parasites or diseases. Ensure that beekeepers are monitoring their hives for pathogens and treating infections that may spill over to wild populations of native pollinators. And control access by honeybees to habitats outside of agricultural lands. Honeybees are the only free-ranging domestic livestock that are able to enter and use private and public lands without any permission. Currently, Yukon does not have a set of territory-wide regulations explicitly for managing honeybees, nor does it have a registry of apiaries. The closest we have to this are a set of regulations for honeybees within Dawson City, and these include an application process and limits on the number of hives per apiary. Most other jurisdictions in Canada have regulations governing beekeeping, including restrictions on the movement of hives. Such regulations were originally developed to protect the health of honeybees in the beekeeping industry. Lastly, recognize that beekeeping is a form of animal husbandry and not wildlife conservation. For conservation and management of wild species such as native bees and other pollinators, solicit advice of qualified wildlife biologists. Thank you for listening. Here are the links to the beneficial management practices that I mentioned earlier and the corresponding story map. The beneficial management practices is a long reference section where you can find additional resources. The prairie crocus in this photo has a nomada species, which is a small native bee. Thank you. So you can
Awesome.
take me off of presenter, I guess.
Sure. If you just want to hit your screen sharing option, you should be able to stop screen sharing.
Oops. I can't actually see anything here. Okay.
Okay. There you go. And Rob, if you want to start screen sharing, you can go ahead and get set up. But thank you so much, Maria, for that great presentation. Super interesting. If folks have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. There should be an option on your screen to do that. We will answer them at the end of the webinar after Rob has finished his presentation, but feel free to pop them in there now, and we'll get to them at the end of the talk. But if you're ready now, Rob, we're going to move into our second presentation on wild pigs, which is presented by Rob Gao. Rob has worked full-time with the Department of Environment and Climate Change with the Government of the Northwest Territories since 1999. He started as a summer student in '92, and after completing his Bachelor of Science, he did his graduate work on barren ground grizzly bears in collaboration with the department. After joining the department, he started with the carnivore program, moved into the wildlife biologist species at risk position, and for the last 11 years has been the manager of the Biodiversity Conservation section. Rob is also vice chair of the Wildlife Management Advisory Council, NWT, the wildlife co-management body for the Inuvialuit settlement region. Today, Rob is going to be talking to us about wild pigs and the risks they pose to wildlife and habitat in the NWT. So go ahead and take it away, Rob.
Okay, can you see my screen okay?
Yep, looks great.
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. There's definitely some commonalities between talking about bees and pigs. Pathogen spillover, some of the things that were already mentioned, not knowing the total numbers of folks with bees or pigs for that matter. So I'll touch on some of those themes as we move along here. So the most common question is, does the Northwest Territories even have pigs? I always have to throw in a Far Side cartoon, of course, because it seems Gary Larson has a cartoon for everything. But yes, absolutely. Pigs have been here for a while, but in small numbers in Northwest Territories. On the screen here is an early attempt at agricultural practices. This was from the 1960s in Rankin Inlet, actually. But there, the pigs were exclusively fed nothing but fish guts. Everybody ended up hating the taste of the pig meat, and it was pretty much considered a failed experiment. Today, there are definitely pigs in the Northwest Territories. We've had stories of pet pigs in the 1990s. There's pictures here of a pet's named Pork Chop. The other one was named Pig Floyd. And today, we still know that there are still some comfort animals, some comfort pets, pigs. But there's also some agricultural pigs in the Northwest Territories today. In fact, Norman Wells, are one of the northernmost communities with pigs, might have the most at the very moment. There could be up to 20 pigs right there today at the moment. In Hay River, we estimate there's maybe about 10 pigs. In Fort Smith, we know that there's a home pet there, plus maybe about 10 pigs. And in Fort Liard, there's a homestead there that has about 3 or 4 pigs. But the simple fact is we have no idea of exact numbers, nor is there any need to report numbers to any government agency. And just Friday, I heard that some of the pigs in Hay River are now taking up residence in local freezers. And then there's this morning, there's now a comfort pig, a pet named Matilda, that's in Yellowknife. That pet was evacuated last night with the forest fires that are going on in Hay River and the evacuation of the town. Do those pigs sometimes escape, whether they're pets or whether they're agricultural animals? Yes, they do. Here's an example from Fort Smith last year. So escapees have not caused a problem yet. Usually the owners are quickly contacted. The pigs are round up fairly quickly, but that's the problem. That's the problem that has plagued other places in Canada and the United States and around the world. So here's another example from the Yukon in 2018. This escape of wild pigs made big news. It made international news in some places. Thankfully, that example was an escape of all female pigs. But this is a problem that nobody wants. But unfortunately, so many jurisdictions already do have these problems of escapes. Here's a picture from a workshop that I attended in Saskatoon. And yes, that is a pig jumping over a 5-foot-high fence. Wild pigs are smart. They're durable. They're proven to be quite crafty to escape. And they are able to survive our Canadian winters quite successfully. Some folks' job all day, in some places in the States especially, is to kill wild pigs all day, every day. I think it's sad for many reasons, mainly to me because they're never going to be eradicated. You're never going to get rid of them. The Eurasian boar is native to Eurasia and North Africa, and it was first introduced into Canada in the 1980s and 90s. It was a livestock, and then the industry was highly subsidized at the time. There are these big visions of having massive exports to Asian markets, and it would be a very profitable industry, but it didn't happen. There are no other species that can be easily confused with a wild pig in the Northwest Territories. All pigs, including the Eurasian boar, domestic pigs, pot-bellied pigs, they all belong to the same species, Sus scrofa. Other common names for wild pigs include wild boars, wild hog, feral swine, razorback, Eurasian wild boar, Russian wild boar. They're all the same. The genetics are all intertwined now. Pigs that have escaped or were intentionally released from farms have now resulted in established populations in all the provinces that border the Northwest Territories. Wild pigs pose a threat to agriculture, wildlife, and habitat in the Northwest Territories and everywhere else that they're loose. They damage crops, they damage native vegetation, they degrade water quality, and they wallow and they root everywhere. They truly are ecological train wrecks. They prey upon native wildlife, including small mammals, amphibians, and the eggs of ground-nesting birds. They carry diseases like tuberculosis that can be infectious to other wildlife and domestic animals and people. They are very, very smart, and hunting actually can make them quickly learn to avoid humans, making them even harder to get rid of and eradicate and hunt. They move to new areas and they become nocturnal. There's a variety of methods people use to manage wild pigs in other places, including trapping, using poisons or other forms of toxicants, but mostly it's professional culling. Recreational hunting is proven not to be an effective management technique for wild pig populations, and they actually make them a little bit more difficult to manage because they are so smart and learn to avoid. Wild pig numbers have grown exponentially since 2001. Most of the range expansion in Canada has been in southern Alberta and Saskatchewan. And this is a series of maps from a publication that was printed in 2019, I think, that shows the incredible expansion of wild pigs. This is the zoom in on the spatial distribution of wild pig occurrences in Western Canada, with dates based on observations, trail cameras, media reports. There's even been some GPS collar data on wild pigs and aerial detections, all relative to where the yellow border of the Northwest Territories is. The blue points near the very bottom of the slide are wild pig occurrences in the prairie ecozone, and then all the red points there are wild pig occurrences in the boreal plains ecozone. The closest recorded wild pig occurrence to the Northwest Territories borders are about 190 kilometers in BC, about 200 kilometers in northern Alberta, and then about 500 kilometers from Saskatchewan, and then about 650 kilometers in Manitoba. There is a very real potential for free-ranging invasive wild pigs to move north to the Northwest Territories, especially given their high movement rates and their high dispersal abilities. So, could wild pigs get established in the Northwest Territories? Yes. There's a but, though. Although we have no large tracts of farmland in which wild pigs on most places use to supplement their feeding, they have already proved to outcompete native wildlife and making homes in the northern provinces. They make actually what we call pigloos to survive winters. They can easily get 400 pounds. They have razor tusks and can defend themselves against predators like wolves and bears quite easily. And as we continue to monitor with climate change, climate change is just going to make environmental conditions in the Northwest Territories even better for pigs, and there will be more opportunities for agriculture in the future. So while there are currently no established populations at 58 degrees north latitude in North America and in Europe and Asia, 66 degrees north latitude in Europe, they exist there. So even though the wild NWT remains wild pig free, there is the potential for wild pigs to continue to move north. So how do we keep the NWT pest free, wild pig free? We have a pest order under the NWT Wildlife Act. That's one tool that we have in our toolbox. The thinking of this pest order is that it's a measure that will help prevent the potential negative impacts of wild pigs from causing damage to the NWT wildlife and habitat. So now any loose pig in the Northwest Territories is considered a pest, and it can be killed without a license by anyone. The picture there of wild pigs on the highway, that's the road to Fort Resolution. It's a sounder of now wild pigs that have been eradicated after the owner intentionally abandoned them in 1996. Again, that was part of the industry that was really promoted to have wild pigs. It was the owner couldn't deal with it at the time. He let the pigs loose. Thankfully, again, they were all eradicated. Another thing that we're doing that I helped with, that's myself and a colleague, Dr. Naima Jutha, we did a wild pig survey. And we also did it testing a new technology using infrared technology. So we flew the 60th parallel using this infrared technology. This is a map of what we saw and when we saw. Thankfully, we didn't see any wild pigs. We didn't see any pigloos. Didn't see any signs of wild pigs. What we did see using this infrared technology, we saw some wolves. We saw some boreal caribou. We saw some bison and moose. Weather did hamper us a little bit at the border crossing there when we flew in November, but it was a good test of the system. And we wrote everything up in a report that is shared. That if you contact Johanna, we can easily share this report with you with the outcome of the wild pig monitoring in the Northwest Territories. We also, as a jurisdiction, we contribute to national initiatives as well. There is currently a draft invasive wild pig strategy. It's a 10-year time frame that the North has made sure that we contributed to and remain engaged in wild pig issues that are going across the country right now, not only wild pigs, but there's a real fear of African swine fever as well, that could significantly impact the agriculture industry as well. And we are working with jurisdictional experts in other places. We are working towards a response strategy. So with the help of Dr. Ryan Brook, this response strategy will hopefully keep the NWT wild pig free for the next 100 years with proper monitoring and a proper response strategy if they ever detected in the Northwest Territories. So what's next? There are a number of steps that we're doing. We are considering monitoring options like future surveys with an appropriate fixed-wing aircraft capable of slow flight speed and low altitude, like this picture here of an avian husky. That other picture right by the husky, that long line, that's actually the border. It's a cut line that's right along the 60th parallel. When we did fly it, that whole border territory, we were actually surprised that it's not really restricted by thick canopy. There's a lot of cut lines that parallel the border as well, so the visibility is actually quite nice when you're flying at low speeds. So moving forward, having a fixed-wing aircraft could be a good solution to do some active monitoring. And we're also hoping to do maybe some passive in-place monitoring, like this picture here of a deployed camera, an ARU sound recorder. There's also, at this particular station, there's a BAT ARU, and there's an I-button temperature logger. It's set up in several other places in the Northwest Territories to help collect information on basic biodiversity. But in the future, having these units deployed along the 60th parallel can help with important biodiversity monitoring and species inventories and expansions from the south from other species like wild-tailed deer, elk, cougar, and some other species as well, along with monitoring for movement of wild pigs. So if you ever see a wild pig or signs like their rooting behavior on the land or landscape damage like you see here, let someone know. The key to keeping the Northwest Territories free from invasive wild pigs is early detection and rapid and aggressive response. The Alberta and Saskatchewan wild pig crisis there is an ideal example of what happens when these rules are ignored. Wild pigs have expanded rapidly out of control across the southern half of those provinces and many other places, mostly in the last 15 years, proving that a small wild pig problem can turn into a very large problem in just a few years. So feel free to squeal. On the screen here is a wildlife observation email address. People use iNaturalist quite successfully as well. And we're going to be moving towards this Squeal on Pigs campaign moving forward if anybody ever sees wild pigs. And with that, thank you very much. And Johanna, I'll turn it back over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Rob. Feel free to stop sharing your screen. But that was a really great presentation. I always appreciate a plug for iNaturalist. I'm a big fan. And yeah, you encouraged folks to report any invasive pigs. I'll just say report any invasive anything. If you see anything that looks weird, out of place, something you haven't seen before, please feel free to send an email to that wildlifeobs@gov.nt.ca email. So now we have some time left over for question and answer. Participants can find either the Q&A box on their screen, or if you for some reason can't find that, you can use the chat and ask any questions that you may have either for Maria on managed bees or Rob on wild pigs. So I don't see any coming in yet. Maybe I'll just ask a question to you, Rob. If there was to be cameras set up along the border for monitoring pigs. Can you just say a little bit more about what that might look like, where they would be?
Even though it was so that one picture of the cut line that we flew over, it is on the grand scheme of things fairly accessible. It is still a very remote area. It would be very, very cost prohibitive to have an entire network of cameras deployed along the entire border, but maybe we can go in small steps. We can start in Fort Smith, and there are plans actually this summer to deploy some camera units at Fort Smith on the border areas moving. There's also easy road access at the Highway 35 at the NWT 60th Parallel Territorial Park, and we can use that easy road access to go east and west from that point. Going into the more remote places, if you wanted to go to Fort Liard south and start moving eastward, it gets a little bit more complex. But hopefully in the future moving forward, maybe we can take small steps and start deploying, and then we can build a relationship with the communities and get self-deployment and self-monitoring in those areas as well.
Great. Thanks for that answer. I've got a question now for Maria, if you want to come off of mute, Maria. Someone has asked, can people use native bee species in their greenhouses or for beekeeping?
That is the problem with these managed bumblebees. They are wild species, and the common one that's being used is Bombus impatiens. That is a native to Eastern North America. So these were commercially reared. But if you want to encourage the native bees to go into greenhouses, you have to open your greenhouse right up, open the windows, and just let them in. That is the best way and the most the least risk to the native bees. Is if they feel like it, they'll go into your greenhouses.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, opening the windows in the spring. But is the person talking about winter greenhouses or just greenhouses in the summer?
I assume summer.
Okay, yeah, just open up the greenhouse.
Would the answer be different in winter? I mean, I guess
well,
there's
they're all
no wild
sleeping
bees.
in winter, so
Yeah.
that's then it's just not possible.
Right. Okay. Yes, of course.
But I'm guessing that NWT is like Yukon. We still have pretty healthy populations of bees here. That it's a real possibility, and there are people in Yukon who grow fruit trees and successfully have the native pollinators do all the work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if that photo of your raspberry patch, I think it was, is any indication, we've got a lot of great pollinators up here. Okay. Not seeing any more questions in the chat yet. Folks on the line, feel free to pop them in there. But if I don't see any more come in the next couple minutes, then we can just wrap up early. Unless there's anything that either of you two want to add. But yeah, I think we can wrap up. Thank you both so much for your great presentations. These webinars will be recorded and shared, so if anyone was unable to join the webinar today, hopefully they can take a look at it later on. I want to, again, just thank you both very much for joining, and also thanks to any of the participants online for joining us today. If you'd like to join us for more great webinars through the week, you can find more information about the rest of our webinars either on our website, that's nwtkisp.ca. I'll spell it out, it's nwtcispp.ca. There's information on there. Or you can look on our Facebook page. That's just look up NWT Council on Invasive Species, Pests and Pathogens for more information about that. But yeah, with that, I think we can wrap up. And thank you again just so much for your wonderful presentations today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
So, thanks. Take care.